This has been a review long in the making. I've had this rifle scope for a very long time, especially compared to many others that I've had, tested, reviewed, and then sent on their way. The reason why this review is taking as long as it has is primarily because I've enjoyed using it so much, I haven't wanted to take it off of any of my firearms and actually do the entire process. As you can imagine, this process takes a very long time, and I really wanted to shake this scope out to see if its performance that I had experienced in Woodland Brutality was just a fluke or not. With that being said, let's jump right into it and do a real quick physical overview. I'm going to breeze over the unboxing portion of this because we've looked at many Leupold products in the past. Leupold boxes are quite nice. They're a good size, they have all your useful information on it, and they're fairly well made. As far as different flavors of Mk4HD 2.5 to 10x42 that you can get first focal plane PR1 MOA reticle non-illuminated, the first focal plane version of the TMR illuminated and non-illuminated, and a second focal plane TMR non-illuminated. So a few different options. For anyone wondering if the new CMR reticle that Leupold's throwing in the Mk5HD 2 to 10 is going to come into this, I highly doubt it. As far as what comes in the box, I really went over it fairly quickly. Bikini caps, instruction manual, and that is it. Looking at the optic now as a whole, I love the proportions on this thing. Another thing I absolutely love is the weight. Leupold claims 21.5 ounces, and boy howdy, that's about as close as you could possibly get. This is far and away the lightest of all of the options that I have seen in this segment of magnification range-ish. If you've seen my IPVO mega comparison, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If you haven't, please go watch that. It'll be linked in the description below. The next best option that I have is the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2 to 12, which comes in at 25.4 ounces. So as near as makes no difference, 4 ounces heavier. Starting at the back, we have a fast focus eyepiece, which is rock solid. It is slimmer than the actual ocular housing, so you don't have to worry about it being protruding and getting caught on things. It's very tight to turn and very rigid once it gets there. Another nice thing about the eyepiece is if you set it and leave it there for a while, the seals will actually lock up on it and make it even harder to turn, which is wonderful. It's one of the better fast focus eyepieces on the market. Another thing that Leupold does wonderfully is their magnification rings. As you can very clearly tell, it's less than 180 degrees from minimum to maximum magnification. Add that in with the fact that you have a giant knurled cattail throw lever on this thing, and it makes it extremely fast to adjust it from minimum to maximum magnification and everything in between. Another benefit of this short sweep is that the tube itself is going to be stronger than most other scopes that have a 180 degree throw, because there is a little pin that goes through the magnification ring into the actual erector inside that adjusts your magnification. So the shorter that sweep is, the smaller that groove is, and thus the stronger the tube is. This being the illuminated TMR version, we have a little push button illuminator on the left-hand side. I'm not the biggest fan of push button illuminations. However, when they are done well, they work well enough for me. Unscrewing the cap yields a standard CR2032 battery underneath it, and well, that's really it. There's no frills with this thing. Leupold really wanted to have this thing be as lightweight as possible, and sometimes running really simple components makes things lighter and easier to produce. And a push button illuminator like they've seen here performs that role perfectly. That little PCB board is the actual button part. The battery slips right inside and the cap screws on wonderfully. About the illumination, you'll see it. It will remember the last previous brightness setting. So let's say you turn it on and you dim it down to wherever and you shut it off. When you turn it back on, it'll remember where you left it, which is at least a pretty nice feature. Another great thing about this optic is how Leupold decided to set up the turrets. The windage is capped, which on a TMR for some people might not be the best setup, but for someone like myself, or for a lot of people that I think would probably be more interested in the scope than they realize, having a capped windage just means that it's one less thing to worry about going wrong in the field. It is properly set up, and unlike the Mk5HDs that have the center stadia line well above that 3 o'clock position, if you're looking at it from the rear, it's right in the middle, and everything lines up fairly well. The only thing I would like to see is that line right there be a little bit longer so you could really line up where the turret actually is and you could see it a little bit easier if you were to make a quick adjustment to it. But other than that, it sounds and feels quite nice. It's fairly tight, and the clicks are nice and crisp. And I have even more nice things to say about the elevation turret. If you are unfamiliar with how Leupold runs their Mark series or their VX series, they have a push button on top which disengages the lock. Automatically, these turrets are locked, meaning they will not turn unless you push the button and then rotate it. I really like this because if you were to return it back to zero, it automatically locks. So it removes all doubt of where your zero is, and it also removes all doubt of knowing that you're actually where you're supposed to be. Another nice thing is, as you start dialing up with elevation, the button goes from just protruding on your first rotation to sunken in, which you'll see momentarily. Overall, I like the turret system a lot. It's not as nice as what we see on the Mk4HD, but this is also half the price of the Mk4HD, which is something I'm going to constantly be reminding everyone of as we go along with this. The one thing about the turret that I'm a little bit like, this could have been done a little bit better, is underneath the first numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way around to 9, there's no real stadia line. So you could have a discrepancy of about 1/10 of a mil off perfect center or not on some of these numbers. Other than that, though, really, really nice. Now, the turret doesn't seem as tight or as crispy as I'd like some of the clicks to be, but overall, it's a very useful and efficient setup. And you know what? While we're here talking about the turret, let's change the video sequence up a little bit. Let's get behind this turret and let me have you experience what I'm talking about. They're not as loud or as crispy as I would personally like for a tactical scope. However, if you're thinking about buying this for hunting, I think you'd much prefer a quieter turret setup to begin with. Now, the key differences between this illuminated TMR and the non-illuminated TMR is the thickness to the stadia lines as well as having illumination. If you really want illumination, I'd highly recommend it. It's actually very good in the scope, but if you don't think you might need it, or you want a slightly finer reticle, maybe go with the non-illuminated version of the TMR, or go with the PR1, which is kind of like a TMR, but even thinner. I don't know how well it would work in the entire magnification range, but I know that it's a little bit finer, and it might appease to some people that are looking for a little bit more precision out of this style of scope. As far as the illumination, it is quite good. You have 10 mils left, right, up, and down, or however you want to do that. Push the button until it goes down. It'll go down all the way till it blinks, and then it'll go all the way up until it blinks to signify that you're at the upper or lower extremes. I would love to see a hybrid of something like with what March does with their higher end optics, but given the price point that this comes in at, I'm willing to accept this sort of illumination. Now, as far as tracking goes, you can very clearly tell that the TMR reticle lines up to my target almost perfectly. As far as changing the magnification, nothing shifts, and despite the fact that this thing has a fixed parallax, I was able to find a good focus between the scope, the target, and my camera to make it work quite well. Bringing it over and up 4 mils, we have about 1/10 of a mil discrepancy on the windage, and bringing it up to 9 mils, we have about, again, 1/10 or so mil of discrepancy. However, the biggest thing is, This turret setup was maxing out at 9.5 mils. I could not go the full 10 mils. It was just bottoming out the erector. So one thing we have to know is if you're running this with a fairly low zero, that zero is configured across the board for a 22 LR at 50 yards. That's what I set it up at. That's what I used to do all of my shooting at. So that's why I left it like that. So if you're running a slightly farther zero, you shouldn't have to worry about it as much, but if you think it might be a concern for you, run a canted mount. But we'll touch on that more soon enough. Overall though, the tracking on this thing is pretty good. I filmed this scope more times than I can even count, primarily because I'd pull it off of a gun, film with it for a little bit, put it back on my gun, shoot my gun and not want to take it back off, or I would then have another scope to do a comparison with and then take it off and compare it real quick and then throw it back on my gun and not want to take it off. And then I decided to do my full-on IPVO comparison where I basically forced myself to finish the review on this scope. But again, I wanted to make sure that the performance that I had experienced with Woodland Brutality was not a fluke. In a slightly lower light environment, the illumination on this thing is superb. Light transmission, as you already saw, is quite good. As we increase the magnification to 10x, there's a slight darkening to the outside edge of the image, but it's very, very minimal. The illumination is wonderful for this sort of twilight-ish hunting realm. Light transmission, looking through the scope versus outside the scope like this, get a good look on that target downrange. That's 81 yards from this current position, and getting behind the scope at 10x really doesn't seem like it's losing that much brightness at all. And if you're using this in a hunting role, odds are you're not going to be at 10x at this sort of distance. But if you are, it's still quite good. We're going to take a much closer look at Eyebox and image stability soon, but let's wind back the hands of time to back when it was the summertime and see how the scope performs in fairly similar lighting conditions, albeit with a much heavier canopy on top. As you can very clearly tell, the reticle is a little bit harder to pick up in the dark shadowy areas. However, to the naked eye, the TMR, at least the illuminated version of the TMR, is nice and thick, and your eye can figure out where it is without really needing illumination. However, augmenting the reticle with illumination in conditions like this is just flippin' wonderful. Again, for you hunters out there that might be shooting in a dark canopy like this in a heavy wooded area, the illumination would really help draw your eye to the center, even though I really do feel like the TMR is as close to being a standard duplex while still being a milling reticle as you could really get. I cannot vouch for the non-illuminated version. I really want to get my hands on one of those eventually, but for right now, this is the best that we have. Like we saw earlier, there's a little bit of a darkening to the outside edge of the image as we increase the magnification to maximum here in this much lower light environment. That is the illumination not on full. That is towards full. That is full, and it flashes to let us know that that, in fact, is the brightest setting that it will go to. If you're unfamiliar or unsure about push-button illuminations, if you do a little bit of training with it, and just understand, like, how many clicks there are, it's not terrible, but it's far and away from my favorite. Lower light environments here, you can see that it does seem a little bit tight on the Eyebox. Again, though, would you really be using higher magnifications in an area like this? Well, if you think that you might, then maybe a slightly larger scope would be a better option for you. Something with a larger front objective, maybe a little bit larger scope tube, a couple of things to really make it a little bit more set up for your needs. See, that's all fine and dandy, but I'm going to be shooting at much farther targets than just 81 yards, and I might actually be shooting in this thing called sunlight. You know what? You're 100% right. Crystal clear, bright, beautiful weather. This is the beginning part, or actually rather the tail end of fall, and panning across this deaded wooded area, that TMR reticle is wonderful to see. In a perfect clear sky, bright sunny day, you're not really going to notice the illumination, but I don't think you're really going to need to. It's there when you need it, and in conditions like this, I highly doubt you need more than that. Cropping the image to our standard crop, we are at 2.5x at about 500-ish yards. Slowly bringing up the magnification to its maximum. That is the image that you can expect on 10x in good conditions. It is flawless. There's nothing to complain about. In my findings, I have found there to be very little to no chromatic aberration. to speak of. And as far as focal issues, I haven't found anything either. A lot of people speculated that this wouldn't be as good because it doesn't have a side parallax. But Leupold must have done some black magic and made some interesting deals with people, because this is perfect. Even inside 81 yards, my target was very sharp and clear at 10x, and out to 1,000 yards on this solar panel. It's very impressive. Not only at the center, but look edge to edge. You have that tower on the far right end, which is about 700-ish yards, and all the way out in the far bits of the horizon, that's over 2,000 yards. It is insanely impressive. And guess what? When you want to dial for elevation, bringing it up to its 9.5 mils as quick as that and reacquiring our 0, to my eye, there's no real loss of image quality here. There's no shift to the exit pupil. The Eyebox still maintains its positioning. It's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic. Bringing it back to our 0 and reacquiring, you can see for yourself, folks, there's very little to complain about. Pushing out to as far as we could see on the horizon, I don't think you could ask for much more than this scope can perform and provide at distances like this. Hell, even some of the bush that's within 100 or so yards in front of us is also in focus. Those legs to the far left, that's like 100 and something yards. That's not very far. It's stellar. And so is the image stability. Look at how sharp the reticle and the target's downrange stay when we shift our focus from perfect center to slightly far left or slightly far right. Bringing it down in increments of 2x, you can see here 8x, it gets a little bit of distortion, a little bit of fisheye, but the sharpness is still more than acceptable. I'm very happy to see that it's very high at 10x because a lot of people are going to be shooting there. Stepping it down even further, we still have a little bit of pulling, but other than that, there's nothing else to really complain about. The reticle is still more than usably sharp all the way out to the far extremes, as is the target's down range. Bringing it down to its minimum, this is where it gets really impressive, folks. Yes, there might be a little bit of warping to the reticle, but there's no parallax shift as far as the reticle shifting on target's downrange. It's tremendous. As is the vastly large, gigantic Eyebox on this thing at 2.5x. Let me make that live for you. Illumination on full, 2.5x. You can basically hold this at arm's length in front of you and still look through it. In fact, on a video that I had posted but had to take down because the range that I filmed it at, might want to revoke my membership. So I had to take that down, unfortunately. I'm still 2 weeks away from figuring out if that's going to actually be the case. Anyway, Eyebox on 2.5x, amazing. Bringing up the magnification, it doesn't matter where we're at. It's still very large and demanding. One of the better performances of any scope ever, really. And part of that has to do with the fact that this is only a 4x multiplier scope. It's got a 42mm front objective and a 30mm tube. I'm sure that combination helps it out, but it's still only a 4x multiplier. At maximum magnification here at 10x, yeah, you could see the edges get a little bit dark when you're not perfect behind it, even though we're in fairly bright conditions. But overall, it's still a very easy to use Eyebox. And that, for me, is one of the best things about the scope, is just how practical, usable, and simple it is. Let's finally look at some side-by-side comparisons. On the left will be obviously the Mk4HD, and on the right, the Mk5HD. We're starting out with this because I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask, is the Mk4HD capable of keeping up with the Mk5? Well, on paper, it's actually pretty decent, all things considered. The length on the Mk5 is about an inch shorter than the Mk4 at 11.2 to 12.5. The weight is about 3.5 ounces heavier at 24 ounces versus 21.5. As far as the field of view, this is going to be a little bit skewed on the bottom end because there's a half X discrepancy, but you have 52.9 feet at 100 yards for the Mk5 versus 42.2 for the Mk4. However, on the top end, apparently, the Mk4HD has a larger field of view, 11 foot to 10.5 with the Mk5. This is a pretty good representation of visually seeing that, but not perfect. There's no tape measure out there with lines every foot. Maybe one day when I own enough property, I'll be able to do that. As far as the exit pupil size for the Mark V, it's 15 to 3 millimeter, which is gigantic, but I could not find out what it is for the Mark IV HD. If you know that information, please put it in the comment section below. Eye relief on them is basically about the same, 3.6 to 3.7-ish to 3.9-ish. But the biggest thing that you must remember is that the Mark V HD is twice the price of the Mark IV HD. And that's not including what the upcharge for the new CMR reticle is going to be on the Mark V HD with its new illumination capacity. New for 2025 is this CMR mil reticle that's going to be exclusively for the Mark V HD 2 to 10. In my humble opinion, this is the reticle that should have come in the Mark V HD from the very beginning. If it did, it would have been 100% perfect. In fact, I titled that video 98% perfect because despite the fact I don't necessarily hate the TMR, I think for when you're spending $2,500 on a rifle scope of this sort of caliber, you should get a slightly better reticle, and the CMR is exactly that. Would I love to see this reticle in the Mark IV HD? I would love to see this reticle in the Mark IV HD, but I highly doubt that's going to happen because this reticle, with the new illumination that Leupold had to develop for it, is going to be an even more expensive option than what the standard illumination is already on the Mark V HD. These should be about $2,700, which is a lot of money. It's a lot of money. I don't care how good the scope is. It's still a lot, and for many people out there, it's well out of their budget. Hell, it's well out of my budget. Fortunately, things like the Mark IV HD exist, but I don't know for how much longer. I say that because I've heard from varying sources, and I don't know if this is true or not, so please don't hold it to truth just yet, but I've heard that Leupold's coming out with new SKU numbers for the Mark IV HDs, and some reps have even said that they might be changing the glass that's in the Mark IV HD. So who knows that in another year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, who knows if the Mark IV HDs are going to have as good a quality glass that are in them as they currently do. And my thought process with that is very simple. The Mark IV HD is much more obtainable than the Mark V HD. As a result, I'm sure the Mark IV HDs have cut into the Mark V HDs, especially these two. I'm sure it's cut into their sales significantly, and thus Leupold's losing money. How could they not? They're selling a scope for half the price and probably outselling the Mark V HD 2 to 10, and with that they're probably losing profits. So that's part of the reason why I think we'll never see the CMR reticle in the Mark IV HD, which is really upsetting. Again, I could be completely wrong, but it also makes sense as to why Leupold would want to lessen the glass that's in the Mark IV HD, because it would just increase their profit margins. Again, this is all speculation and hearsay. Please do not think that this is actually happening, because I do not want to get sued again, or at least attempted to be sued again. Yes, that's happened in the past several times. So please, just understand that, okay? This is all speculation, but it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. And how could it not? Just look at the two images here. Yes, a little bit of chromatic aberration at 3 o'clock on the Mark IV HD. Mark V was filmed under lighter conditions, or at least lesser sun conditions, but fairly similar times of the year. The Mark IV HD just performs extremely well, as does the Mark V HD. But is the Mark V twice the scope of the Mark IV HD? I really don't think so. I think it's 25-30% more than the Mark IV. Sure, it's got a much larger tube, it's got a smaller front objective, it's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit heavier, but the controls are a little bit more polished. The turrets have a little bit more bite to them, and everything feels just a little bit higher quality than the Mark IV. But that's not to say that the Mark IV feels like it's a piece of poop. It's not. It actually feels extremely good in hand. It's got very good quality materials, albeit with the elevation turret, like I mentioned earlier, just doesn't have the same feels I've come to know and love from Leupold. And to answer everyone's question, which one would I pick and why? The Mark IV HD, because it's half the price and performs very close to how the Mark V does. Next up is probably the comparison many of you are probably most excited for, and guess what? So am I. The Mk4 HD versus the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2, my scope of the year for 2023, which, yes, I am still holding very true to my words because it really is, well, was and will remain to be that good. A couple of key differences. Price. There's a huge gap between the last one, and there's a huge gap between these two. Mk4, as configured, is about $1,200. You could find them for around $1,000. The Helos, mid to high 400s. Every once in a while they'll pop up about 500. Every once in a while you'll find them on sale for low 400s. In the used market, I've seen them go for high 3s, which is just, it's insane. Just buy it at that point. On paper, the Helos is actually a little bit shorter, 11.8 inches to 12.5, but it is 4 ounces heavier at 25.4 to 21.5. Field of view, again, on the minimum is going to be a little bit skewed, and same on the maximum because the magnification ranges are not 100% the same. 55.7 to 9.6 with the Helos, and 42.2 to 11 with the Leupold. As far as eye relief, they're basically the same. The key differences here, view through them. The Helos is significantly larger than the Mk4, and the reticle. The Helos reticle, the AMHR2, I think I got that acronym right, I always screw it up. It is far and away one of the best setup reticles for this sort of magnification range. A lot of people criticize the center dot is too big. It's a 1 MOA dot, folks. If your gun is shooting tighter than 1 MOA, you're probably going to want to shoot with a much larger magnified scope. Maybe a 3-18 or a 5-25 at the bare minimum, where you're going to have a much finer center point. For a general purpose do-it-all rifle, though, I don't think you can do better than what you see with the Athlon. As far as the image sharpness, though, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. The Helos has a very good looking image, something I still enjoy, but the Mk4 HD has that extra vibrancy, that extra life, that extra level of sharpness to it that I really am getting addicted to. Even though it's a much smaller view looking through it compared to the Helos, I just love how the image looks through the Leupold. It's wonderful. However, price point aside, I think the Mk4 is a slightly better scope. It definitely has better components. It definitely has better feeling materials. It just feels like a much more premium scope. But that's not to say that the Athlon feels like it's just going to fall apart. I've run it through the ringer for numerous years, and it still performs perfectly to this day. Which one of these is better? If your budget will allow, the Mk4 HD is a wonderful experience. But if you're on a lower end budget, or if you're unsure of the magnification range, I really don't think you could do much better than the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 to 12 as a do-it-all rifle scope. The Vector Continental 2 to 12 is extremely close, but it's favoring a little bit more on the precision side of things. But as a general purpose do-it-all sort of setup, these two are extremely hard to beat, folks. On the higher side of budget, we have now the NightForce NX8 2.5 to 20. They both have the same minimum, and actually, their field of views at minimum are very close to one another. 41.8 to 42.4. The Leupold still has it beat ever so slightly, but look at the view looking through these two and how different they are. The targets downrange are the same size, we're at the same distance, but through the NX8, they look significantly larger because they are. Because the view through it is probably 30% larger than what we see through the Mk4 HD. The NX8 is just so impressive in that regard. It's impressive in a lot of ways, but the main reason why I'm showcasing these two is because maybe you just want a little bit more magnification, and that's fine, but you still want a 2.5x. Well, the biggest thing that you have to take into consideration is how usable is the reticle going to be at the minimum magnification. Well, as you just saw, the Mil-XT found in the NX8 is basically invisible at the center up until about like 8 to 10-ish x. Below that, it really is quite hard to see, as opposed to the TMR, which is basically the exact opposite of the Mil-XT. Truthfully, though, I think these two scopes are going to occupy two different realms of their magnification ranges, respectively. The Mk4 is lighter, albeit not shorter. It's actually a ½ inch longer than the NX8, but it's also 7 ounces lighter than the NX8. It also has full capped and locking turrets, whereas the NX8 has an exposed non-locking but zero-stopped elevation. And then the reticle options are actually better with the NX8. But again, because of its vast magnification range, it's an 8x multiplier as opposed to a 4x multiplier. The reticles are going to suffer at the lower magnifications. If NightForce would ever listen to me and throw their DMX reticle inside the NX8 2.5 to 20, it would probably solve 99.9% of this thing's issues. The only other 0.1% thing that I could then have any sort of about would be the locking elevation turret. But the main thing is just how practical and usable the reticles are for the entire magnification range. That's something I'm actually a big stickler about. And the DMX reticle would fix that with the NX8. But think they're going to do that? I highly doubt it. Field of view, bare minimum. It actually goes to the Mk4HD. I already talked about that. Exit pupil, no real information on the Mk4, but 7.1 to 2.5 on the NX8 is a little bit on the tighter side. And the eye relief is a little bit shorter on the NX8, 3.4 to 3.6 to 3.9-ish with the Mk4. If you really want a 2.5 minimum and a 20x top end, the NX8s are amazing. However, I think they're definitely much more catered towards the more precision side of things, but a lot of people have mentioned in comments that they still use that scope for hunting and they're very happy with it. So it really comes down to what you are willing to accept for your setup. Either which way, both of these optics are fantastic. You know, see, you're right. I love the concept of the Mk4HD, but I want a little bit more magnification. What do you recommend? Well, going back to the GOAT, it's the Optica 6 3-18 by 50 in the first focal plane featuring the MRAD1 reticle that was developed by Dark Lord of Optics. It has been a staple on this channel since I first bought it many moons ago, and it probably still will remain. However, again, I've heard from whispers through the trees that Meopta might be pulling out of the US market, and if so, there will go all of the supplies of these Optica 6s. In fact, it's already very hard to find these 3-18 by 50s in the first focal plane available anywhere nowadays. It seems like they've all just dried up. Euro Optic usually had a lot of them in stock, but I think they've been out of stock for quite some time. However, when you do find them brand new and available, they're right around $800, so fairly less expensive than the Leupold options. However, I do believe that these Meoptas are made in China. You wouldn't guess that, though, with how they feel. Construction-wise, hands-on-wise, control-wise, they are supremely nice, well above their price point. Optics are also extremely nice. This is a very old video, and unfortunately, I haven't remembered to bring the Meopta to go film in any recent years. It's been a long time, but in fact, I'm actually going to the range this weekend to remedy that issue because I'm tired of not having up-to-date footage looking through the Meopta. Everything about the Meopta is flawless in my opinion. The way it's designed, the way it's developed, every feature that it has, it's very reminiscent of the Mk4HD that we are looking at here. The only real key difference is the Optica 6 has a side parallax because it needs it because it's a 3-18. But beyond that, they're basically the exact same scope. It's just the magnification range has changed slightly. However, a couple things that we can talk about. The length on the Optica 6 is 14.6, so 2 inches longer than the Leupold. It's also about 8 ounces heavier than the Leupold, so the Meopta is definitely on the heavier side. Field of view is also going to be struggling because it's, again, a half X difference. So 33.5 feet to 42.4, and at the top end, 5.8 to 11. But most of those differences are because of the magnification ranges. Both of these are excellent, both of these are great, and both of them serve a very similar role, albeit with a slight twist.
We are at 10x.
Because this scope was featured in my Mega IPVO comparison video, I have footage of me taking it out to 600 yards at Tommy Gun Warehouse in Greeley, Pennsylvania. This is with a trigger cam 2.1, I want to say, and the focus between the scope and the actual camera itself didn't necessarily favor the closer distances here. Those steel targets were at 100 yards. Every target set's actually at a 100-yard increment. Now we're at 200 yards, and for the first volley, I'm going to just hold using the reticle at distance. Go from 200 to 300, and I still wasn't 100% sure on where my dope was and where I had to hold. I was using my Ruger American Gen 1 in 5.56, which is a tack driver. I was shooting 77 grain AAC OTMs, which are about an inch and a quarter round through this gun. Out to 400 yards, hold, break a shot, fairly easy. Those are reduced size IPSCs at 500 now and then 600. And you could see, yes, the TMR reticle is quite thick at 5 mils. You could actually see that it increases the thickness of the line from 5 and above. But we could still pick out some of that target at 500 yards, and those are reduced size targets. If they were full size targets, it would be much less of an issue. I felt very confident with my shots on the IPSC, so I decided to go to a smaller gong, and once I figured out where the wind was, it was very easy to start engaging these targets. Again, is it perfectly ideal for this situation? No, but if you're looking for a very fast reticle pickup, figure out where the elevation is, and then hold, and then send around, well, as you can very clearly tell, out to 600 yards, this scope is more than capable holding for elevation. Now, there are a couple of other things I would like to see changed with the TMR here specifically. Yes, it goes out to 10 mils on both the windage and the elevation in all directions. However, I get lost with the in-between stadia lines up front. I know that where it steps up, where the actual duplex reticle steps up, is 5 mils, but in between that, it takes me a second or two to all right, count 1, 2, 3.5. Okay, that's where I'm supposed to be. If they had just broken up and put a 5 in the middle, I think it would help. Or maybe do what USO does with their mil gap, which is every 2 mils, they put a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I think that would be really, really slick. But again, think Leupold's going to do that for us? Probably not. I know the PR1 is a little bit better set up than the TMR in that regard, but I think it's just going to be a little bit too fine for my personal preferences. What I've done now is I have adjusted the elevation turret to compensate for the drop, and we're going to hold dead center. As you can see, out at 400 yards, it's as simple and as easy as that. The center dot on this TMR reticle, I should have mentioned earlier, is quite small and precise. So if you did want to take a more accurate shot, just dial for your elevation. This scope really does bridge the gap between speed and precision, I feel, quite well, despite how thick the reticle is. That was 1 for 1 at 4, 5, and 600 yards through the scope on this rifle in fairly messy conditions. It was raining, it was windy, and it was very cold, but this package performed flawlessly. But that was still not the first time that I experienced shooting the scope at distance under duress. I bought this specifically to throw on this, my Tikka CTR in 308, to shoot at Woodland Brutality 2024. And this package, right before you, was sensational. It allowed me to close the gap between many other people running much faster guns than I, even if they were running intermediate cartridges, because I was able to make first round hits consistently. On a 308, I was running about a 200-yard zero, and I would hold just a little bit high if I needed to out at elevation, and as you will soon see, it worked flawlessly. I do feel that for this rifle, being very accurate and a little bit on the heavier side, I would prefer a little bit more magnification to really extract its maximum potential. However, if I was to shorten this barrel to 16 inches to make it a little bit handier, this scope and gun combination would be almost impossible to beat. It's almost a match made in heaven. And to show you some match footage of what I'm talking about, this stage I think went out to about 400 yards with targets at 200 and 400 yards, multiple shots on each target. And once I found out where my zero was and where I had to roughly hold, or at least figure out where the targets were first, it was a cakewalk. I never exceeded 6x on this optic at any distance engaged at this match, and the reason for that was I didn't have to use more magnification than that. At 6x, it was a very good compromise between magnification, field of view, and Eyebox. Everything worked extremely efficiently. With the ammunition that I was running through this gun, it's about 1 1/4 to 1.5 MOA, which shooting on full-size steel targets at 400 yards is not a real issue, as long as you can line everything up and your windage is good and your holds are good. Tikka is an amazing rifle. But the scope really does allow me to use that rifle to a fairly high potential. Again, would I like to have a 30-18 on that gun? I might actually throw my Optica 6 on there eventually, but all of my systems are going to be getting revamped soon, so I'll cross that bridge when I get there. With that, though, I might as well start getting into my final thoughts. There isn't a whole lot else I could really show you in this video other than me getting very low and muddy for all of your entertainment. So I might as well just talk about the scope and what I think about it. Since the first time I opened the box and I held this thing in my hand, I have been impressed by it. Every single time I've gotten behind it, I've been impressed by it, even to this day. Despite its minor shortcomings, which I would say the view through it is a little bit on the smaller side, as you've already seen, especially compared to things like the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 or the NightForce NX8, the sharpness, the clarity, and the ease of which you can get behind this thing glass-wise is just, it doesn't make a lick of difference how small the view is through it. It's tremendous. Like many people, I was very skeptical that this scope would be able to perform well at all, especially with my previous experiences with things such as the Credo 2-10 and some other similarly spec'd scopes where they just didn't seem to be properly worked out and put together. And that's exactly why I put my money where my mouth is and bought it. And I'm very glad that I did. I wasn't sure how I was going to like the illumination as far as the push button. But coming to understand this scope as a concept, I actually prefer it because it's smaller, it's lighter, and it's easier to work with, and it's less likely to break because there's fewer moving components. The turret's basically perfect. The magnification ring is perfect. It's one of the best on the market. The eyepiece, even though it's a fast focus, again, once you set it where you need to and you leave it there, those seals tighten up to the point where you can't turn it without having to overcome that. It's small enough, it's more than light enough, and the reticle set, I think, is more than set up for how this scope should be used. And that is actually more of a crossover scope than anything else. Whether you're using it in a tactical role like this, where you're holding for elevation on a target, in this case, I was just using the TMR reticle to hold, and I was making first round impacts out to 400 yards. What more could you ask for? Or if you're looking for a lightweight optic that would be really good for a hunting role. The fact that this thing doesn't have a side parallax, but yet doesn't need a side parallax inside of 100 yards at maximum magnification is insane to me. It's perfect. This is how most scopes of this setup should be. Super easy, super fast, super efficient. There's fewer moving things that you have to worry about, and it just works in perfect harmony. If you're thinking about buying this for a hunting setup that might do some tactical work, or if you want to build a very lightweight tactical rifle, I don't think that you could do better than this Mk4HD in a general purpose role. I'm going to say this now with full confidence and full passion behind it. I really do believe that this is the best scope that Leupold has on the market available today. And with that, thank you all so very much for watching. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.